The evening air bit into Darnell's skin as he wiped down the last table by the window. It was the kind of cold that made your breath visible in puffs of white, each exhale carrying a hint of winter's harshness. The streetlights flickered weakly outside, casting long, jagged shadows on the cracked sidewalks. The city was quiet tonight, the usual hum of traffic and chatter muted by the chill. Inside, Sunny Diner was warm, the kind of warm that wrapped around you like an old blanket. The smell of sizzling burgers and fresh coffee, mixed with the scent of lemon cleaner, creating an atmosphere that felt both familiar and comforting. It was a humble diner, nothing fancy, but it had a soul, a place where the regulars knew your name. And the food was always good, no matter how tired the cook looked. Darnell liked it here. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like home, or at least the closest thing he could get to it these days. His rag dragged across the tabletop, leaving behind a trail of dampness. As he moved to the next table, he caught sight of something outside the window, a figure huddled against the cold. A man. He was crouched in the shadows, his coat hanging loosely around his thin frame, and his hands wrapped tightly around a cup that was probably empty by now. The man's eyes were wide, glazed, staring at the diner as if it were a beacon of hope in the night. His clothes were ragged, his beard scruffy, but it was the look in his eyes that grabbed Darnell's attention. Hunger. No, not just hunger. Desperation. Without thinking, Darnell turned toward the kitchen, his mind already made up. He grabbed a plate from the warmer, a grilled cheese sandwich with a side of fries, and poured a glass of water. He didn't ask anyone, didn't hesitate. It was the right thing to do. As he headed toward the door, a sharp voice cut through the air. "What are you doing?" Darnell froze. Melissa, his manager, was standing at the counter, arms folded across her chest. Her heels clicked sharply on the tile as she approached, her face twisted in irritation. "Tell me you're not about to give food to some homeless guy," she said, her tone dripping with judgment. "Especially one of those—" Her words hung in the air, heavy with disdain. Darnell's grip tightened on the plate, his chest tightening as well. He knew exactly where this was going. "He's hungry," Darnell said quietly, trying to stay calm. Melissa scoffed, her eyes flicking to the window where the man still stood, waiting. "Oh, I'm sure he is," she sneered. "And what happens when you feed him? He brings his friends, and suddenly we're running a soup kitchen. Is that the image we want for this place?" Darnell's stomach twisted. He wasn't going to let her talk like that. Not about him, not about the man outside. "This is one plate of food," Darnell shot back. "We throw away more than this every night." Melissa's eyes narrowed. "We throw it away because it's garbage," she hissed. "Not hand it to beggars." The tension in the air thickened as the words lingered, cold and cutting. Darnell swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "He's not garbage," he said firmly, before turning back toward the door. Melissa's voice followed him, sharp and angry. "You're really making a fool of yourself, Darnell." Darnell's hand rested on the door handle, his heart pounding. He stepped outside into the cold, his eyes immediately locking with the man's. For a moment, neither moved. Then, the man spoke, his voice rough, dry, like he hadn't had a drink in days. "I don't want trouble," he rasped, his voice carrying a strange weight for someone in his condition. "I just want something to eat." Darnell hesitated. There was something about the man's tone, a steadiness that didn't quite match his appearance. But before he could ask another question, the door to the diner creaked open. Howard, the general manager, stepped inside, his sharp eyes flicking between Darnell, Melissa, and the man outside. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low and measured. The moment Howard entered, the air inside the diner shifted. The usual buzz of background chatter faded into the background as everyone seemed to hold their breath. Darnell's hand hovered near the door, the plate of food still in his grasp. The homeless man stood just a few feet away, his weathered coat barely holding together. Despite his ragged appearance, there was something commanding about his presence, something that made Darnell uneasy in a way he couldn't explain. Melissa, ever quick to seize an opportunity, didn't hesitate. Darnell thought it would be a good idea to start feeding every vagrant that stares through the window, she said, her voice sharp, dripping with mock sweetness. Apparently, we're just giving out free food now. Howard's gaze flicked to Darnell, then back to the homeless man outside. His expression was unreadable, but Darnell could feel the weight of the scrutiny. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Howard spoke again. Is that true? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, the kind that made Darnell feel like he was being interrogated, not simply asked a question. Darnell stood tall, trying to hide the frustration in his chest. I paid for it myself, he said firmly, keeping his voice steady. He didn't care what Melissa thought. He knew what was right, and he wasn't backing down. Melissa's lips curled into a thin, sarcastic smile. Oh, how noble of you, she sneered. But do you really think one sandwich makes you some kind of hero? Darnell could feel the heat rise in his chest, his blood starting to boil. It makes me better than you, he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Melissa's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't respond. Instead, she crossed her arms tightly over her chest and turned to Howard, as if Darnell were nothing more than a nuisance. Howard's eyes never left Darnell. This isn't about the sandwich, is it? He asked, his voice low and calm. Darnell's jaw tightened. No, it's about doing the right thing, he replied, his voice measured. It's about showing compassion. Melissa let out a scoffing sound. Compassion? She said with mock disbelief. What? Because he's poor? You think he deserves special treatment just because he's hungry? The man outside shifted, stepping closer to the window. Darnell couldn't help but glance at him, wondering if he was catching the conversation. Howard let out a heavy sigh, his arms crossing over his chest. I think we've had enough of this, he said. Everyone, in the back. Now. Melissa's eyes lit up with satisfaction. She knew she had the upper hand. She had played the game right, throwing the weight of her prejudices around. But Darnell wasn't backing down. As they made their way to the break room, Darnell couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something more than just the tension in the air. The man outside, the way he'd spoken so evenly, so deliberately, it didn't match his appearance. He didn't act like someone who was used to begging for scraps. Darnell had seen that look in people's eyes before, the pride in their stare, the determination. This man wasn't just hungry. He was something more. The small break room was dimly lit, the fluorescent light flickering above them. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the grease from the fryer. Darnell sat at one of the cramped tables, his fingers clenching around the crumpled napkin in front of him. Across from him, Melissa leaned back against the counter, a smug expression on her face. Howard didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the room, arms folded, studying them both with a detached look in his eyes. It was like he was waiting for something to happen, something he already knew was coming. So, Darnell, Howard said, his voice breaking the silence, you want to explain to me what happened out there? Darnell looked up at him, his eyes steady. I gave him food, he said simply. He was hungry. Howard's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips pressing together. You've been working here long enough to know that it's not always that simple. Darnell's chest tightened, but he kept his voice even. It is simple. He was hungry and I had food. I gave it to him. Melissa snorted, the sound of her derision cutting through the room like a knife. See, that's the problem right there, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. You think you can fix everything with a plate of food, but you're only making things worse. We can't just hand out meals to anyone who asks for them. People like that, they're just going to take advantage. Darnell shook his head. That's the problem. You think people like him don't deserve basic dignity. Howard watched the exchange silently, his gaze flicking from Darnell to Melissa, then back to Darnell again. He seemed to be taking everything in, calculating something in his mind. After what felt like an eternity, Howard finally spoke. Enough, he said, his voice firm. Darnell, you're right. You did the right thing. Darnell blinked in surprise, but Howard wasn't finished. But Melissa, he continued, his tone growing colder, you've crossed a line. Your prejudice is not something we tolerate here. Melissa's expression faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing with defiance. Howard turned to Darnell, his eyes softening just slightly. You did what was right, and that's what this place needs. Someone who stands up for what matters. We need more of that around here. Before Darnell could fully process what was happening, Howard's voice cut through again, this time with a finality that left no room for argument. I'm moving you to assistant manager, Darnell, he said, his voice steady. Effective immediately. Darnell stared at him, stunned. What? Howard nodded once, the corners of his mouth tugging upward just slightly. You stood up for the right thing, and that's what matters. Darnell stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to catch up with what Howard had just said. Assistant manager? The words didn't seem real. He glanced at Melissa, her face now pale, the smugness evaporating as she fumbled for a response. You can't be serious, she stammered, her voice losing some of its earlier bite. I am, Howard replied, his gaze steady. Darnell is the kind of person we need to lead this place. Compassion, integrity. He embodies what this diner should stand for. You, Melissa, well, you clearly have some growing to do. Melissa's face flushed with anger, her lips quivering as though she were trying to suppress the venom that was about to spill out. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a voice interrupted. I think that's enough. Don't you? Darnell's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar, yet strange in its calm authority. The homeless man, the one Darnell had given the meal to, was standing at the entrance of the break room. His weathered coat still hung loosely from his shoulders, but his posture was different now. He was no longer just some cold, hungry stranger. There was something undeniably commanding about him now. Howard's eyes widened, but he quickly recovered. Bradley? The homeless man smiled faintly and nodded. That's right. Darnell blinked in disbelief. Bradley? The owner? The man who had founded the diner? The man whose face Darnell had only ever seen in photos on the wall? He couldn't believe it. The whole time, he had been standing right there, watching, testing them. What is this? Melissa sputtered, her voice wavering. I suppose I should have introduced myself sooner, Bradley said, stepping into the room fully. But I needed to see who you really were, Melissa. And, unfortunately, I've seen enough. He turned to Darnell, who was still processing the shock of the moment. You showed real character today. Your empathy for others. Your willingness to act despite what others might think. That's the kind of leadership I want at this diner. Darnell couldn't stop staring at him. But I don't understand. Why pretend to be homeless? Bradley sighed, the weight of his words heavy. Because too often, people like you, Darnell, get overlooked. The world is quick to judge people based on their appearance, their circumstances. I wanted to see who would stand up and do what's right, even when no one else was watching. And you did. Darnell's throat tightened, the realization hitting him all at once. He hadn't just passed a test. He had shown Bradley the very thing he hoped to inspire in others, a willingness to treat every human being with dignity, no matter their situation. Bradley turned to Melissa, his expression hardening. As for you, I've seen all I need to. I can't have someone running this diner who doesn't believe in treating people with respect. Melissa's face twisted with fury, but Bradley didn't flinch. I'm afraid you're being demoted, Melissa. You're still a part of the team, but you will no longer have the manager position. Melissa stood there, her jaw clenched, before she stormed out of the room without a word. The door slammed behind her, leaving an eerie silence in her wake. Bradley turned back to Darnell, his gaze softening. I'm proud of you, Darnell. You passed my test, not because of the right answers, but because you followed your heart. It's a rare thing to find. Darnell opened his mouth, unsure of what to say. This was beyond anything he could have imagined. Not only had he stood up for what he believed in, but now he was being given a chance to change things for the better. I don't know what to say, Darnell muttered, a mix of disbelief and gratitude in his voice. Bradley smiled warmly. You don't have to say anything. Just keep doing what you're doing. You're going to do great things here. Darnell felt a surge of pride he hadn't expected. As he looked around the break room, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a mission, and he was ready for it. The next few days at the diner were filled with an undercurrent of tension. Word had spread quickly among the staff, and there was a quiet buzz that hung in the air like static electricity. Darnell's promotion was the talk of the kitchen, and even the regular customers seemed to notice something different in the atmosphere. The place felt lighter, somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. Melissa, though, was a different story. She still worked her shifts, but the sharpness in her movements was gone. The usual smirk she wore so easily had faded, replaced by a stiff, almost robotic smile. She no longer held any authority in the diner. Howard, who had once been her right-hand man, had become more neutral, his interactions with her noticeably cooler. Darnell, on the other hand, found himself in uncharted territory. As the new assistant manager, he was responsible for ensuring everything ran smoothly. But he was also aware of the eyes that followed him. Staff members who were still processing the changes, customers who now seemed to respect him a little more, and Melissa, who hadn't exactly congratulated him for his new role. Despite the awkwardness, Darnell didn't let it distract him from his work. He spent his days managing the flow of the diner, stepping in where needed, but also keeping a careful eye on the staff and making sure that everyone, from the newest waiter to the oldest cook, felt valued. One evening, as Darnell wiped down the counter after the last of the dinner rush had passed, Howard approached him with a serious expression. Darnell, he began, his voice low, you're doing a great job, but I need to talk to you about something important. Darnell raised an eyebrow. What's up? Howard glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. Bradley wants to implement a new policy. Starting this Friday, the diner will offer 1 free meal per person, no questions asked. It's part of a bigger initiative, a change in direction. Darnell's eyes widened. Wait, you mean anyone can come in and get a meal for free? Howard nodded. Exactly. No judgment, no questions, just food. It's about dignity, Darnell. Everyone deserves a meal, no matter their situation. Darnell absorbed the words, feeling a surge of pride. This was the kind of place he wanted the diner to be. No pretenses. No one left behind. I think it's a good idea, Darnell said, his voice steady. It's about time we did something like this. Howard smiled faintly. I agree, but it won't be easy. Some people are going to push back. You know how Melissa felt about the homeless man, And she's not the only one. There will be others who won't understand. Darnell nodded. He had expected this. Change was never easy, especially when it challenged long-held beliefs. "I'm ready for it," he said, a sense of resolve settling in his chest. Howard clapped him on the shoulder. "I'm glad to hear that. You're the right person for this." That night, as Darnell walked home under the dim glow of streetlights, his mind raced with thoughts of the diner's future. The decision to offer free meals was a bold one, but it was also the right one. And with his new position, Darnell felt an undeniable sense of responsibility. He wasn't just a waiter anymore. He was a leader. As he neared his apartment, he thought back to the man who had stood outside the diner that night, the one who'd sparked all of this. Mr. Bradley. What if it hadn't been a test? What if Bradley had just seen something in him that no one else had? Maybe, just maybe, he had chosen Darnell not because of his actions in the moment, but because he knew Darnell would make the right decisions for the diner's future. A small smile tugged at Darnell's lips as he stepped inside his building. Things were changing, and he was ready to be a part of it. The day had finally arrived. The diner was buzzing with nervous energy as employees prepared for the launch of the new free meal policy. It wasn't just any Friday. It was the first Friday where anyone who was hungry could walk in, no questions asked, and get a free meal. A simple act that promised to have a huge impact on the diner, but also one that had the potential to spark controversy. Darnell stood at the counter, watching the clock tick down to the opening hour. He felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. There was so much riding on this policy, on how the customers would respond, on how the staff would handle it. It was a defining moment, not just for the diner, but for him personally. Melissa walked past him, her steps stiff. She hadn't said a word to him since the meeting with Bradley, and Darnell didn't expect that to change now. Her role had been demoted, but she was still a fixture at the diner, her presence hanging like a cloud. "Ready for this?" Darnell asked her, trying to sound casual. Melissa didn't look at him, her eyes focused on the task at hand as she wiped down the tables. "I suppose," she said flatly, her tone lacking the sharpness it once had. But Darnell could tell she wasn't thrilled. The door swung open, and a man walked in. Darnell noticed him immediately, a thin, weathered figure with hollow eyes, his clothes ragged and torn. He looked out of place in the diner, but that's exactly why he was here. Darnell gave him a warm smile and stepped forward. "Good evening," Darnell said, his voice welcoming. "What can I get for you?" The man hesitated, looking unsure of himself. "Just a cup of coffee, if that's all right." Darnell nodded, but something told him that the man wasn't here just for the coffee. He could see the hunger in his eyes, the weariness in the way he stood. Without a second thought, Darnell added, "How about something to eat too?" "On the house. We're offering a free meal tonight. No questions asked." The man blinked in surprise, his hands shaking slightly as he reached up to adjust the worn-out cap perched atop his head. "You sure? I don't want to cause any trouble." "No trouble at all," Darnell assured him, smiling gently. "It's a new policy. Everyone's welcome." The man hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded. "Okay, I'll take the meatloaf special." Darnell motioned toward a booth in the corner. "You can sit anywhere you like. I'll have the kitchen get that started for you." As Darnell turned to head into the kitchen, he noticed a few regulars watching the exchange. They weren't saying anything, but their glances were heavy with judgment. Darnell knew what they were thinking. They were wondering how long this policy would last, and whether it would affect the reputation of the diner. But he didn't let it faze him. This was the right thing to do. And if they didn't see it now, they would eventually. Behind the counter, Darnell could see Melissa still moving through the motions, but there was a new wariness in her eyes. She kept glancing at the man in the booth, her posture tense. The man was alone, eating slowly, savoring each bite. His face softened as he ate, and Darnell couldn't help but notice the way his shoulders relaxed. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the dignity of being treated like a person. The door opened again, and more people started to trickle in. A few regulars, some new faces, and even a couple more homeless men, looking hesitant but hopeful. As they walked up to the counter, Darnell smiled and greeted them, offering the same invitation. "Come on in. The first meal's on us tonight." The evening continued, and as Darnell worked through the dinner rush, he kept an eye on the newcomers. Some looked uncomfortable at first, unsure of how to navigate this new dynamic in the diner. But as the night wore on, something began to shift. The atmosphere wasn't just different for the people who were receiving free meals. It was different for everyone. The diner felt warmer, more open, more alive. By the time the last few customers filtered out, Darnell's heart swelled with pride. The policy had been a success. Not only had people been fed, but the diner had become a place where people from all walks of life could sit down and share a meal without judgment. Melissa, who had been unusually quiet for the rest of the evening, approached Darnell as he wiped down the last of the tables. She still didn't meet his eyes, but there was something different in her demeanor now. Something softer. "You did good tonight," she said, her voice uncharacteristically subdued. Darnell looked up at her, surprised by the shift in her tone. He offered a small smile. "We did good. Everyone did." For a moment, Melissa seemed to hesitate, her eyes flicking toward the door where the last few customers had just left. Then she sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "I never thought I'd see the day when this place actually did something like that," she murmured, almost to herself. Darnell could tell she was conflicted. Her pride was still bruised from the fallout of the previous week. But the truth was that this new policy was a step in the right direction for the diner, and for her too. "You know," Darnell said, his voice soft but steady, "it's not too late for change." Melissa didn't respond right away, but Darnell could see the gears turning in her head. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand. As the lights dimmed and the last customers departed, Darnell glanced out the window. The street was quiet now, but in his heart, he knew something significant had just begun. The following week was a quiet one, but the ripple effects of the new policy were evident. As Darnell worked his shift, he noticed subtle changes in the diner. The staff, who had once been uncomfortable or skeptical about serving homeless customers, now approached each situation with more compassion. Even Melissa, who had resisted the change at first, seemed to be adjusting. One afternoon, as Darnell was refilling drinks, he saw her walk up to a table where a man in tattered clothes sat, nervously glancing around. It was Marcus, a homeless man who'd frequented the diner several times since the policy had started. Normally, he'd be treated with disdain or indifference, but today was different. Melissa bent down, smiling warmly. "Hey there," she said softly, her voice carrying a tenderness Darnell had never heard before. "Can I get you anything today?" Marcus looked up, startled at the kindness in her tone. "Just some soup if you don't mind," he said, his voice quiet but grateful. Melissa nodded and turned toward the kitchen, her face thoughtful. Darnell watched from across the room, his heart swelling. This wasn't just a gesture. It was a shift in how the diner was operating, how the staff was viewing people in need. For the first time, he saw Melissa not just as a colleague, but as someone learning, someone growing. Later that evening after the dinner rush, Darnell spotted Melissa cleaning up at the counter. He approached her cautiously, unsure of what to expect. She looked up as he neared, her expression neutral. "You're doing well, Melissa," Darnell said, trying to sound encouraging. "I saw you with Marcus today." Melissa set down the rag she'd been holding, her gaze softening. I was wrong, Darnell. About everything, she admitted, her voice quiet but sincere. The way I treated people, I just never thought about it like that. Darnell smiled, his heart light. You don't have to apologize. All that matters is what we do from here. She nodded, her eyes thoughtful. I know, and I want to keep doing better. I've seen how much a little kindness can change things. As the night came to a close, the diner had an energy about it that felt different. A sense of unity, of purpose. The walls that had once been built around the customers and staff had started to break down, replaced by a shared understanding that everyone deserved respect, no matter their background. The door swung open, and in walked a familiar face. Mr. Bradley, the owner of the diner. He stood for a moment, surveying the room, before walking over to Darnell. You've done something remarkable here, Bradley said, his voice warm with admiration. I knew when I saw the way you stood up for what was right, this diner would change. And now, I see it's not just the food that's changed. It's the hearts of everyone here. Darnell met Bradley's eyes, a sense of pride swelling inside him. We're just getting started, he replied. Bradley chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling. I think this place is going to be something special. I want you to keep leading this. You're the heart of what makes this diner different now. The words hit Darnell harder than he expected. A promotion to assistant manager, his dream job, the one he'd worked tirelessly for, was now his. But more than that, the diner had become something more than just a business. It had become a symbol of compassion, of second chances, and of growth. As the staff gathered to close up for the night, Darnell took a moment to look around the diner. The clinking of silverware, the laughter from the back booth, the hum of conversations, all of it felt right. Things had changed. And it was all because one person had chosen to act with compassion, to challenge prejudice, and to stand up for what was right. This was just the beginning.